Right now, on the lake in front of you, most of the water is something a fish cannot use. Not doesn't prefer, cannot use. Somewhere in the heat of July, a large part of that lake quietly became a place a bass or a walleye physically can't breathe in, and the fish can't tell you that. So it does the only thing it can. It leaves, or it stops eating, and it waits. And here is the mistake. You keep casting into that water anyway. You stand on the same bank that handed you a 5-pounder back in May, you tie on the lure that worked, and you throw it, over and over, into a stretch of lake that has no fish left in it to catch. 3 hours, nothing. Then you start changing things, lure after lure, like the answer is in the tackle box. And the story you tell yourself is that the bite died, or the fish got smart, or you just need a better bait. The bite didn't die. You're standing over the wrong water. There is a thin band of that lake, sometimes only a few feet of it, where the temperature and the oxygen still line up into something a fish can actually live in. Find that band, and the summer slump is over. Miss it, and it does not matter what is tied to the end of your line. That band is the whole game, and almost no one is ever taught to find it. There's a reason for that, and it isn't a conspiracy. You can't sell a thin layer of water. You can't shrink wrap it, you can't patent it, you can't hang it on a peg at the end of an aisle and sell it back to you every spring in a new color. An industry built on the next lure has no product to make out of the words, "The fish are pinned to one floor of the lake right now." So it sells you the lure instead. The knowledge that would actually fix your day has nothing to ring up at the register. I have spent more time than I can count lowering a temperature and oxygen probe down through summer lakes, watching the exact depth where the water stops being livable scroll past on a readout. Once you have seen it on a screen, you cannot unsee it on the water. So let me show you where that living layer is, how to find it from the bank with nothing but your eyes, and why the fish are doing exactly what the physics says they have to. It starts with what happened to that lake the moment the heat moved in. If you have done everything right and still gone home empty in the heat, this was never your fault. Nobody ever handed you the one fact that explains it. So here it is. A fish is cold-blooded. It does not hold its own temperature the way you do. Its body runs at whatever temperature the water around it happens to be. When that water climbs into the 80s, the fish's whole metabolism speeds up with it. It needs more oxygen, not less. And that is the cruel part, because warm water holds less. This is just physics, and it is worth seeing the actual numbers. Cold water near 40 degrees Fahrenheit can hold around 13 milligrams of oxygen in every liter. Warm that same water into the upper 60s, and the capacity falls to about 9. Push it into the 80s, and there is less still. So as the fish is asking for more, the water is offering less and less. Most warm water game fish need somewhere around 5 milligrams per liter to stay active and feed. Drop below that and they go sluggish. Lower than that, and they are just trying to survive. Now picture the lake as a house in a heat wave. The attic, the top few feet baking in the sun, is full of fresh air, but it is far too hot to stay in. The basement is cool, but it is sealed up tight. And over the long summer, the air down there goes stale until there is almost nothing left to breathe. So the whole household crowds onto the one floor in between, where it is cool enough and there is still air to use. Fish do exactly the same thing. By midsummer, a deep lake settles into layers. A warm top layer the sun keeps stirring, and the air keeps feeding with oxygen. A cold bottom layer, cut off from the surface and the light, where the oxygen slowly drains down toward nothing. And caught between them, a narrow shelf of water that is cool enough to be comfortable and still carries enough oxygen to live in. Biologists call it the squeeze, and that is exactly what it is. Research tracking walleye with acoustic tags in Lake Ontario watched fish get pinned in place, pressed from above by heat and from below by dead, oxygen-starved water, into a thin, livable band. That band is where your fish are, not scattered across the whole lake, concentrated, sometimes brutally, into a sliver of it, which means the entire problem of summer fishing collapses down into one question: where is the living water, and how do you find it standing on the bank? You read it, and the lake will tell you, if you know what you are looking at. You do not need a $400 electronics package to start. You need to learn to read three things, and you can do every one of them from shore. Start with the bank itself. Where the shoreline is low and slopes in gently, the water off it is shallow, and in summer, shallow usually means warm and thin on oxygen by the afternoon. Where the bank is steep, undercut, dropping straight down into the water, there is depth below it, and there is shade. On a hot noon, when the open shallows are cooking, it is cooler under that cut bank, and fish slide into it. A steep bank is the first thing I look for on water I have never seen. Steep bank, deep water, shade. That is an anchor. Then read the plants. This is the part most people walk straight past. Aquatic plants do not grow at random. They grow in a band, out to the exact depth where enough sunlight still reaches them. Reeds and cattails in the shallows, lily pads and floating leaves a little deeper, submerged weeds deeper still, and then they stop. That outer weed line, where the green quits, is roughly the depth where the light runs out, and where the light runs out is where the lake stops making oxygen down low. So the grass line is not decoration, it is a map of the living water, drawn for free, right there on the surface. Last, read the surface itself. Dark, calm, glassy water usually means depth and slow current. A riffle, a seam, a patch of nervous water breaking lighter over a shallow bar, that is moving water, and moving water carries oxygen. A steady breeze stacking waves into one shoreline is doing the same job, mixing air down into the lake and pushing the bait ahead of it. None of this sits on a shelf anywhere. There is nothing to ring up for, read the grass line. Nobody can sell you the slope of a bank. That is exactly why it went quiet, not hidden, just never worth anyone's while to put in front of you. It is also the cheapest electronics you will ever own. So now you can read where the living water is. Let me show you the handful of places it pools up the thickest, the spots that hold fish in the heat almost every single time. Once you know what living water looks like, the lake sorts itself into a short list of places it gathers. Learn these, and you arrive at any unfamiliar water with a starting point instead of a guess. First, anywhere cooler, fresher water comes in. The mouth of a creek or a feeder stream, especially one running out of shade or up out of a spring, pours water several degrees colder and richer in oxygen into a baked lake. Fish feel that the instant it arrives. On a hard July afternoon, the mouth of one small inflow can stack up more fish than a mile of open bank. It is the most underrated spot in summer, and people walk right past it, because the bank around it is brushy and awkward to fish. Second, structure that touches the living layer. Out on the main lake, a point that runs out and drops off, a hump that rises up off the bottom, a ledge where the contour lines crowd together. These let a fish sit at the exact depth where the temperature and the oxygen are right, and slide a few feet up or down as the day changes without ever making a long trip. Find the depth of the living band first. Then find the structure that reaches it. Third, shade over deeper water. A thick mat of matted weeds, a fallen tree, the dark face of a bluff. Shade is not a small thing in the heat. It is a cooler pocket and an ambush point at the same time. A predator can hang there, out of the sun and out of the light, and let the water bring food to it instead of burning energy chasing it down. Crappie do it under docks. Catfish do it in the deep shade of a laydown. Bass do it on the dark side of the grass. And fourth, the wind-blown shore. It is the uncomfortable bank, the one blowing straight into your face, the worst one to cast on. Fish it anyway. The wind drives oxygen into that water and pushes the baitfish up against it, and the predators follow the bait. The pretty, calm, sheltered side of the lake is usually the empty one. Notice what every one of these has in common. Not one of them is a thing you buy. The inflow, the point, the shade line, the windward bank, the industry cannot ship you any of it. It can only sell you something to throw once you are already standing in the right place. Getting to that place is on you, and now you know how. But being in the right spot is not enough if you are there at the wrong time or on the wrong day. And the way most anglers read the weather is built on something that simply is not true. Here is something you have been told your entire fishing life. Watch the barometer. When the pressure falls, the fish feed. When it rises, they shut down, because the change in air pressure squeezes the gas bladder inside the fish and makes it uncomfortable. It is in the magazines. It is on the apps. It gets repeated at every boat ramp in the country. Most of that story does not hold up, and the man who took it apart is a real scientist. David Ross, an oceanographer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, looked hard at the claim that fish sense the barometer and react to it. His point is simple, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. A fish changes the pressure on its own body far more by swimming down a foot or two than any passing weather front ever changes the air above the lake. A big front might nudge the barometer a tiny fraction. A fish crosses more pressure than that just by easing off a ledge. If small pressure changes genuinely tortured fish, they could not live in a water column at all. So why does the bite so often swing right before a storm? Because it was never the needle. It is the weather the needle is announcing. The barometer is a messenger, not the cause. When a front rolls in, everything changes at once. The light goes flat and gray. The wind picks up and stirs oxygen into the water. The temperature drops. The bait starts to move. The fish are responding to that whole package, and the falling number on the gauge is just the front signing its name. You have heard the old line too, wind from the east, fish bite the least. There is a grain of truth in it, but not the way it sounds. An east wind tends to ride in on cool, unsettled post-front weather, and it is that weather, not the compass direction, doing the work. And notice which part of this whole story the market fell in love with. You cannot sell a weather front, but you can absolutely sell a gadget with a needle on it. That is worth remembering any time a piece of fishing knowledge shows up conveniently attached to a thing you can buy. Here is the edge. Stop staring at the pressure number. Read the front itself. The hours right before a summer storm rolls in, flat light, building wind, dropping temperature, are some of the best feeding you will ever see. But the moment you hear thunder, you are done. A graphite rod in an open boat is the last place on earth you want to be in lightning. No fish is worth that. Which leaves the question of timing. What hour you should be standing in that living water, and the honest answer surprises almost everyone. Everything I have laid out so far, how to read the living layer, the short list of places it pools, the truth about the weather front, and the sources so you can check every word of it for yourself, I have gathered onto a single page you can tape inside your tackle box lid. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the last two pieces are the ones that separate a good summer angler from everybody else. The exact hour to be on the water, and the one change to your retrieve that the biggest fish in the lake cannot ignore. You already know the morning bite is real, but here is a wrinkle almost no one mentions. In a weedy, green, productive lake, the oxygen does not peak at dawn. It bottoms out there. All night long, with no sunlight, the plants stop making oxygen and start using it, and by first light the whole lake is at its lowest, thinnest point of the entire day. So dawn is prime for cool water and low light, yes. But if your morning bite quits early and quits hard, that is why. The lake is catching its breath. The two windows that hold up best in real heat are the cool edges of the day. Early morning and the last hours of evening, when the sun finally comes off the water and the surface gives back a few degrees. And then there is the one most people sleep right through, the night. When the sun goes down, the top of the water can shed several degrees. The shallows that were a dead hot bathtub at 2 in the afternoon turn livable again. The bait moves back toward the banks and the weed edges, and the biggest predators in the lake follow them up into the dark. And in that dark, a predator is not really hunting with its eyes. Picture a sense of touch that reaches out, several feet, through the water itself. A sense that can feel a struggling baitfish before it ever sees it. Fish have exactly that. It is a line of tiny motion detectors running down each side of the body, and it reads the faint water movements that everything alive gives off. Horst Bleckmann, a sensory biologist at the University of Bonn, and Cheryl Coombs, who has spent a career on this system, have shown that a fish can build a picture of its whole surroundings, find prey, dodge a rock, from water motion alone, in total darkness. The name for it is the lateral line. The useful version is this. At night, a fish feels you coming. So fish the dark for what it is. A shiny, lifelike lure is invisible at night, so switch to solid black or dark profiles that throw a hard silhouette against the lighter surface above. And give that lateral line something loud to lock onto. A wide thumping blade, a churning surface bait, something that shoves a lot of water. In the black, the fish is not reading the paint job. It is reading the wake. A quick, honest word on the moon, because you will hear a great deal about it. The idea that the moon directly overhead opens an exact feeding window, the evidence for that is mixed at best, and on a lake with no real tide, there is not much underneath it. The clock that actually moves the fish is light and temperature, not a number on a lunar table. And if you do fish at night, respect it. A red headlamp keeps your night vision and spooks less. Wear your life jacket, and know the water before the sun is gone. The lake is a different animal in the dark. One thing left, and it is the mistake the biggest fish in the lake are counting on you to make. You bought a lure that swims perfectly, straight, smooth, steady, and you reel it back in the way it was built to move, one even speed, all the way to the bank. In summer, to the biggest fish watching it, that steady, healthy swim reads as one thing: too much work. Here is why. A summer fish is stressed and conserving. Its metabolism is already running hot in the warm water, and it is doing the math on every meal, calories spent chasing against calories gained eating. A perfectly healthy bait fish, fleeing at full speed, is a bad deal. Too fast, too fit, too likely to get away clean, so the fish lets it go. But something hurt, something fluttering, stalling, falling helplessly toward the bottom, that is a free meal, that is easy calories. And that, it cannot resist. It helps to know how these fish actually eat. They do not really bite. They inhale. Peter Wainwright, a biologist at the University of California, Davis, whose lab has filmed largemouth bass feeding in high speed, describes it cleanly. The fish opens its mouth so fast, it creates a pocket of suction and pulls the prey straight in with the water. To get that suction, it has to commit, and it commits to the target it judges easiest to catch. So stop swimming a healthy fish, swim a dying one, snap the rod tip, then drop it and let the line fall completely slack. Do nothing for 3, 4, 5 seconds. Let the lure stall and flutter down on that slack line. It will feel wrong. It will feel like you stopped fishing. That pause is where the giants are caught. And the strike often will not be a thump. You will go to reel and the rod will just feel heavy, like you hooked a wet towel. That is a big fish that eased up and inhaled a lure it was certain was already dead. One more. For pressured water. If the fish are stuffed, feeding hard on a school of bait, and then suddenly off, do not throw something bigger. Throw something smaller. A full fish will not chase a meal, but it will sip a tiny, helpless one drifting past its nose. When in doubt in the summer, downsize. So go back to that lake from the very beginning, the one where most of the water was something a fish could not use. Nothing about that lake has changed in the last 20 minutes. Same heat, same dead basement, same thin living layer. What changed is that you can read it now. You know where the living water is, you know the hour to be standing in it, and you know the one move that turns a follow into a strike. None of it was ever printed on a package, because a package had no reason to print it. The tackle wall will always have something new to sell you. It will never sell you this, the water itself. Read honestly, on its own terms. If you would rather fish knowing what the wall will not tell you, you already know which side of this you are on. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling the rest of it back into the light, one lake at a time.